During the first quarter, my novel-based research paper, A History of Women's Rights, posed the following question. Does time make societal equity more attainable? By the end of the document, it was quite clear that the answer was no. But also, yes. How could this be? The paper focused on an array of varied disciplines and found that many progressions and many regressions have been made over the last 33 years. For this, my semester project, I chose 5 central disciplines from last quarter's research to emphasize: discrimination, the societal pressure to live a stereotypical life as an American housewife, and the lack of fulfillment that often comes with it, STEM, the gender wage gap, and education. Then, for each discipline, I researched one prominent woman who focused her efforts on fighting for or against each principle or barrier. You may have heard of pertinent women like Malala, Michelle Obama, or even Sandra Day O'Connor. But this documentary will fixate on the female figures that society often seems to forget. The unsung heroes. The daughter of former slaves, Mary Jane McLeod Bethune became one of the most important black educators, civil and women's rights leaders, and government officials of the 20th century. The college she founded set standards for today's black colleges, and her role as advisor to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave African Americans an advocate in government. Born July 10, 1875, near Maysville, South Carolina, Bethune was one of the youngest of 17 children. After the Civil War, her mother worked for her former owners until she could buy the land on which the family grew cotton. Deborah Mickles writes, Bethune could pick 250 pounds a day by age 9. In 1894, she graduated from Scotia Seminary, a boarding school in North Carolina. Bethune then attended Dwight Moody's Institute for Home and Foreign Missions in Chicago, Illinois. After she completed her stint at the institute, no church was willing to sponsor her as a missionary, so she became an educator. Shortly after beginning her career, she married fellow teacher Albert Bethune, and in 1899, the couple had a son. Soon after, they moved to Palatka, Florida, where she worked at the Presbyterian Church and sold insurance. Her marriage ended a few years later in 1904, so she opened a boarding school called the Daytona Beach Literary and Industrial School for training Negro girls to support herself and her son. Eventually, Bethune School became a college, merging with the all-male Cookman Institute in 1929 to form Bethune-Cookman College. In 1920, an established educator, Bethune risked several racist attacks by founding many organizations to promote racial and gender equality and leading voter registration drives. According to The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow Stories, she raised money to pay poll taxes by going door to door in Daytona, Florida, and collected enough to cover the cost of 100 voters. Utilizing her background as an educator, she instructed African American women on how to pass the literacy test. When they caught wind of her voting-related activities, the Ku Klux Klan threatened to burn down her school. She stood in front of it all night, ready to defend the campus, but they never showed up. Despite the fact that she had to face off with the KKK, the next day, she still led her crowd of 100 to the polls. Later, largely due to her aforementioned efforts, Bethune was elected president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. In 1935, she became the founding president of the National Council of Negro Women, and around that time, befriended future First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The next year, her bond and background combined to Bethune's benefit, and she became the highest-ranking African-American woman in government when Franklin Delano Roosevelt named her Director of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration. She remained until 1944. Deborah Mickles. As the leader of FDR's unofficial Black Cabinet, Bethune took definitive and frequent opportunities. She organized a conference on the problems of the Negro and Negro youth in 1937, which fought to end discrimination and lynching, and in 1940 became the vice president of the National Association of Advancement for Colored Persons, a position which she held for the rest of her life. She was chosen as a member of the advisory board that created the Women's Army Corps in 1942 and assured that it was integrated. After her time as director under Roosevelt expired, she was appointed by Harry Truman the next year as the only woman of color to attend the founding conference of the United Nations. She continued her political and social involvement throughout the next decade until her death in 1955. Honored with many awards, Bethune's life was celebrated with a memorial statue in Washington, D.C. in 1974, and in 1985 was even commemorated with her own postage stamp. To date, her final residence in Daytona, Florida, is named as a National Historic Site. Born Betty Naomi Goldstein on February 4, 1921, Betty Friedan was a journalist, activist, and co-founder of the National Organization for Women, one of the early jumpstarters of the women's rights movements in the 1960s and 70s. Her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, voiced millions of American women's frustrations with limited gender roles and sparked widespread public activism for gender equality. Friedan grew up in Peoria, Illinois. Her father was a Russian immigrant and jeweler, while her mother was a Hungarian immigrant and journalist. Friedan was well educated and was a psychology graduate summa cum laude from Smith College. She dropped the E from the end of her first name while she spent a year on graduate fellowship to train as a psychologist at University of California, Berkeley. Friedan spent time as a reporter for Federated Press and writer for UE News. Her politics moved increasingly towards the left. As World War II raged on, she became involved with various labor and union issues and authored union pamphlets arguing for workplace rights for women. This was her first instance of activism for women's rights, says author Deborah Mickles. In 1947, she married Carl Friedan, then had 3 children, and continued to work throughout each pregnancy. However, after moving from Queens to suburban Rockland County in 1956, Friedan became a housewife and freelance writer for women's magazines and began research for her future groundbreaking novel, The Feminine Mystique. Initially, at her Smith College 15-year reunion, she conducted a survey of former classmates and realized that most, like herself, were dissatisfied with the limited world available to suburban housewives. To create her literary masterpiece, Mickles informs, Friedan spent 5 years conducting interviews with U.S. women, charting the white middle class's metamorphosis from the independent career-mindedness of the 20s and 30s to those of the post-war era, expected to find total fulfillment as wives and mothers. Ultimately published in 1963, The Feminine Mystique became an instant bestseller and continues to be regarded as one of the most influential nonfiction books of the 20th century.
I merely was writing a book, and yet underneath, it's strange. There was this sense of urgency and importance, as if perhaps a part of me knew. If I thought about things like destiny, I would think that there was something there.
After her novel's impactful publication in 1966, Friedan co-founded the National Organization for Women, also referred to as NOW. NOW demanded that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission enforce provisions of Title VII guaranteeing equality in employment, and also sought to end the long-standing practice of sex-segregated help-wanted ads. Friedan also helped to found the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. She organized the Women's Strike for Equality on August 26, 1970, on the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage, to raise awareness about gender discrimination. The next year, she co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus, which altered outdated laws such as unfair hiring practices, gender pay inequality, and pregnancy discrimination. From the 1970s onward, Friedan published several books, taught at New York University and the University of Southern California, and lectured widely at women's conferences around the world. She died in 2006 of congestive heart failure. Megan Smith, the third Chief Technology Officer to the President of the United States of America, was born on October 21, 1964. An award-winning entrepreneur and engineer and technology phenom, Smith was named her position in the Office of Science and Technology by former President Barack Obama in September 2014. She served as the first female and first lesbian CTO. In her position, which she held until 2017 and is now vacant under President Donald Trump, she focused on how technology policy, data, and innovation can advance a nation's future. However, Smith converged on the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics long before her time in the White House. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in mechanical engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and completed her master's thesis work at the MIT Media Lab. Article Megan Smith from the White House Archives states that she was even a member of an MIT student team that designed, built, and raced a solar car 2,000 miles across the Australian outback. Soon after graduating, Smith served as CEO of Planet Out, an LGBT online community in the early days of the web, and partnered with AOL, Yahoo, and MSN. She also designed early smartphone technologies at General Magic and worked on multimedia projects at Apple Japan. Smith contributed to a wide range of engineering projects, including an award-winning bicycle lock, a space station construction program, and solar cook stoves, and later returned to her university to serve on the boards of MIT, MIT Media Lab, MIT Technology Review, and Vital Voices. During her time at Google, Smith led new business development for 9 years, managing early-stage partnerships, pilot explorations, and technology licensing across Google's global engineering and product teams. She later served as vice president in the leadership team at Google X and co-created the company's Solve for X Innovation Community Project and its Women Tech Makers Tech Diversity Initiative. Additionally, the Megan Smith page informs, she led acquisitions of major platforms like Google Earth, Google Maps, and Picasa, and served as general manager of Google.org during its engineering transition, increasing employee engagement while adding Google Crisis Response, Google for Nonprofits, and Earth Outreach/Engine. Today, she is an advisor to the Joan Gans Cooney Center and co-founder of the Malala Fund. A trailblazer and advocate for workers' rights, Esther Egerton Peterson has been honored by the National Women's Hall of Fame as one of the nation's most effective and beloved catalysts for change. In 1981, she received the United States' highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, to honor over 50 years of activism. Among other involvements relating to the fight for truth in advertising and creating sell before and nutrition labels for food products, she became a driving force to make equal pay for equal work law. Additionally, she reinvigorated the women's movement in the 1960s by creating the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women and documenting discrimination against the suppressed gender. The daughter of Danish immigrants, Peterson was born to a Mormon family on December 9, 1906, in conservative Provo, Utah. She graduated from Brigham Young University and moved to Boston in 1932 with then-husband Oliver Peterson. There, she taught at a prep school and volunteered at the Young Women's Christian Association, also known as the Y and the YWCA. During her hours working at the Y, she first discovered and fought racial discrimination after realizing that Black women had to use the facility across town. She pointed out the hypocrisy behind the segregation, considering that the Y's purpose statement included equality and justice, and eventually, the YWCA became integrated. At age 12, states AFL-CIO article Esther Egerton Peterson, she thought unions and laborers were evil when she witnessed a railroad strike. However, when most of her Y students participated in the garment industry's Heartbreakers strike, Peterson was inspired and altered her vision. She later became involved with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and spent summers working for summer school for women workers in industry, which brought young working women from across the country and several nations together for classes. In 1938, she became a paid organizer for the American Federation of Teachers, and the following year, she joined the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union and became the group's first lobbyist in 1944 in Washington, D.C. At her first meeting, all the male attendees stood up when she walked in, to which Peterson promptly announced, "Please don't stand up for me. I don't intend to stand up for you." Webpage Esther Egerton Peterson also relays that as she was new and a woman, she was assigned to a new rep who many thought wouldn't amount to much, John F. Kennedy. Peterson's main projects included raising the minimum wage from 40 to 75 cents an hour and getting workers covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established minimum wages and work hours. When Kennedy later became president in 1961, he appointed Peterson as head of the Women's Bureau in the United States Department of Labor. There, she hosted a series of nationwide hearings with working women. Discussions included the value of work inside and outside the home, race and gender discrimination, the glass ceiling, and, primarily, equal pay and closing the gender wage gap. After gathering her findings, Peterson then established the President's Commission on the Status of Women to further study the standing of females in the U.S. and develop equality recommendations. The Commission's final report addressed lack of daycare and equal pay for equal work, as well as women being clustered in low-wage work. Peterson's commission also laid the groundwork for the National Women's Committee on Civil Rights. Additionally, Peterson was a driving force behind the passage of the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and because of her work, was later named Assistant Secretary of Labor for Labor Standards.
I think we're making progress in other ways too, because now we have on the books some laws that really protect women. We have the Equal Pay Law, for example, that there shall be a rate for the job, and it is illegal for two people to perform the same job and there be one rate for a woman and another rate for a man.
She utilized this position to enforce laws regarding minimum wage, work hours, and health and safety protections. After living the rest of her days giving interviews, engaging with women and their needs, and of course, advocating for equal pay, Peterson passed away in 1997 at age 91 in her D.C. home. In Paia, Hawaii Territory, on December 6, 1927, the first Asian female and first woman of color to be elected to Congress was born. Patsy Matsu Takamoto Mink valued education from an early age, graduating from Maui High School in 1944 as class president and valedictorian. She attended Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and University of Nebraska at Lincoln, ultimately graduating with a BA in zoology and chemistry from the University of Hawaii in 1948. After leaving college, Mink planned to get a medical degree, but turned to law after several schools turned her application down. She earned a JD from the University of Chicago Law School, and, states article Mink, Patsy Takamoto, was the first Hawaiian Nisei woman, whose parents were immigrants from Japan, to do so. She married John Francis Mink and had a daughter named Gwendolyn. When she tried to settle in at a big law firm, she faced discrimination due to her interracial marriage, so she went into private practice and lectured in business law at the University of Hawaii. In 1954, she founded Oahu Young Democrats and worked as an attorney for the Territorial House of Representatives in 1955. She then won re-elections in 1956 and 58 before winning a seat in the Territorial Senate and serving from 1958 to 59. When Hawaii achieved statehood in 1959, Mink aimed for the lone seat on the House of Representatives. However, when Hawaii's delegate and Democratic boss John Burns caught wind of her campaign, he convinced Daniel K. Inouye to abandon his Senate campaign and file for a House seat instead, because he did not like Mink. This forced a primary, which Mink lost by a 2-1 margin. Throughout her whole life, Mink received no support from her state Democratic Party. She won a seat in Hawaii State Senate from 1962 to 64, where she eventually chaired the Education Committee and focused on school efforts for young women and girls. In 1964, when reapportionment created a second seat in the House, Mink ran again, without the blessing of her party, and barely edged out 2 other Democrats in the primaries to secure a spot on the ballot with Inouye's successor, Spark M. Matsunaga. In response, Democrats arranged deals to support Republican nominees to beat her. Despite this, both Democrats were ultimately elected, and Mink became the first Asian American woman and second Hawaiian woman to serve in Congress. Mink, Patsy Takamoto. In her subsequent 5 re-election campaigns, Mink faced hardship from her local Democratic Party, which twice ran woman candidates to deprive her of the gender issue. She responded with continued triumph by greater and greater margins. In the House, Mink served on the Committee on Education and Labor from the 89th to 94th Congresses. She also advocated many women's issues like equal rights. One of her greatest legislative triumphs was the Women's Educational Equity Act, which allotted $30 million a year in educational funds for programs to promote gender equity in schools, increase educational and job opportunities for women, and excise gender stereotypes from textbooks and curricula. Perhaps most famously, Mink also built critical support for Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which barred sexual discrimination in institutions receiving federal funds and opened up opportunities for women in athletics. She also co-sponsored the Gender Equity Act in 1993 after being disturbed that gender discrimination persisted 20 years after the passage of Title IX. The act, and Mink, asserted that targeting gender bias in elementary and secondary education would help reduce inequalities between the sexes. Mink continued her political activism throughout the rest of her life, including fighting for women's rights by co-chairing the Democratic Women's Caucus in 1995. After a month-long battle with pneumonia, Mink took her last breaths on September 28, 2002, in Honolulu. Shaking up those who discriminate. Escaping societal pressures and expectations. Leaping headfirst into a world where no one looks like you. Demanding rights and equality that the oppressed deserve. Succeeding despite society rooting for you to fail. Each of the featured women are so much more than their respective discipline and represent characteristics that aim to inspire and motivate those who are deemed inferior by the rest of the world. Remember their names and keep their messages in mind. Mary McLeod Bethune. Breaking Down Barriers. Megan Smith, Breaking the Mold. Patsy Mink, Fighting Against Prejudice. Esther Peterson, Fighting for You. Betty Friedan, Running a Movement. Women running the world.